Hello and welcome to Crossing Channels. I'm Richard Westcott. Can we make climate policy fair and effective? That's the subject of the latest in our collaboration between the Bennett School of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge and the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse at the Toulouse School of Economics. As ever, we're going to draw on the interdisciplinary strengths of both institutions to explore a complex issue: how governments can design climate policy that works both on paper and in practice, how the costs and benefits of the transition are shared across people, places and generations, and what it takes to build the trust and institutions needed to sustain action over decades. So to explore these issues today, we have Alessio Terzi from the Bennett School. Alessio, start us off. What does your research focus on?
I'm an economist, and I have been working on climate change and the interplay between that, capitalism, and economic growth. So at the heart of my research is this question of whether you can have green growth and how to achieve it.
And joining us from the TSE, we have Christian Gollier. Christian, remind us of your main research interests.
Well, I'm interested in determining what's the responsibility for the future generation, in particular how to translate that into rules for action, in particular in the domain of climate change.
Climate policy is often framed as a technical challenge: reduce emissions at the lowest cost. But in practice, it's also about fairness and consent. Who pays, who benefits, who gets heard, and whether policies can last across electoral cycles. Over the past decade, those tensions have only become more visible as governments have moved from setting targets to making choices that distribute costs and benefits, and as public support has become a decisive constraint on what is politically possible. The World Economic Forum's latest Equitable Transition report captures this tension clearly, warning that affordability pressures and social alignment can shape whether climate ambition holds. So, in this episode, we're asking, how do we make climate policy that is effective, fair, and durable? Alessio, in a recent work, you argue that a rapid shift to low emissions risks livelihoods and communities, and that energy transition also needs to be a just labour transition. Can you tell us what you mean by that, and could you sum up your findings?
Yes, you are referring to joint work that was recently published on Nature Communications, and what we were doing there was trying to bring attention to the labor dimension of the green transition. We often talk about firms, we often talk about what this will do to different countries and industries, but what does it mean in practice for jobs? And there we were mostly raising questions because nobody really has the answers to many of these points, but we were bringing attention to the fact that jobs will be created. Most projections that are available out there suggest that more jobs will be created than destroyed. So that's the good news. The bad news is that these jobs are not generated necessarily in the same industry nor the same place. And so that is where these questions of equity come into play and what governments can or should do. And again, what we were trying to point the attention to in this paper was, first, there will be a need for retraining. And so to accompany this transition, you can't just do it and then hope for people to tag along. There will be a need for place-based industrial policies. And what this means is that for a long time, we just assumed that jobs will be created and people will move to follow the jobs. Now, we know that people hate doing that. And there is a lot of evidence that suggests that behind the votes of discontent, whether it is Brexit or Trump or others, there is this feeling that there are some areas that have been left behind. And so you want to create jobs in those areas, and this doesn't happen by chance. You need government policy to accompany this. And then one final point, a lot of countries have taken already measures to decarbonize their economies. They have taken measures to accompany the green transition. So there is a lot to learn in terms of playbook out there. What we were trying to point out is that what has worked in developed countries will not necessarily translate one-to-one in developing contexts. And one example of this is to realize that informality, so workers working in the informal economy and not the formal economy, are predominant in low-income countries. What this means is that if you design policies to accompany the transition, that might have worked well in Norway, or it might work well in Denmark, but it's not going to work very well in a low-income country. And so you have to factor that in while you are implementing policies to create these new green good jobs.
Are we seeing this becoming a bigger political battleground? We're certainly seeing it in the UK at the moment, climate policies affecting ordinary people and politicians starting to talk about it, aren't they?
Absolutely.
So do you think it's going to be a growing issue as elections come forward in this country, in France and so on?
The way I look at it, the green transition is a major transformation of our economy. What I've been describing it as is a bit something that resembles an industrial revolution in the sense that everything directly or indirectly contributes to CO2 emissions right now, and we live effectively in a fossil fuel civilization. So we have to move to an economy that is decarbonized, which means you have to transform the whole of your economy. I've been arguing that we need a positive narrative around it. To just give a narrative of we have to do it because this is the right thing to do is not going to get us very far. It might be right from an ethical perspective, but it's not going to get us very far in implementation terms, which at the end of the day is what we're interested in.
Yeah, as ever with politics, you've got to bring people with you. You've got to bring voters with you. Christian.
Well, two things on this. I think Alessio is perfectly right to say that jobs are crucial in this domain, and there is a big risk of derailing the climate ambition of Europe because of jobs. Most of the jobs creation for the energy transition are in China with the photovoltaic panels, the electric cars, and all those things. So that's an important point, jobs. And behind this question of jobs, there is this issue of industrial policies in Europe. The second thing I want to say as a reaction to Alessio is I disagree with the issue of how to present things. And of course, we need a story. We need to move people in favor of the transition. But the problem is, and that's the other part of the coin, which is, the costs are large. Think about, for example, airline industry replacing kerosene for planes, which come from fossil fuel, by synthetic kerosene. Increase the cost of this energy by a factor between 5 and 10. Electric cars are still much more expensive than thermic cars. And if you look at steel production, cement, fertilizers, moving to a decarbonized solution make those costs much larger. And therefore the political issue here is how to organize the society in order for our liberal democracy to accept those additional costs at the time where the benefits of action are global and they are not local. The big problem here is that the costs are local. They are borne by the people, they are borne by the enterprises that are doing the decarbonization efforts, but the benefits are global. And therefore, we have here a problem of coordination. I think we will talk about that later on.
Yes, because basically there is an opportunity there for certain political parties, isn't there, to fight the transition?
Yeah, indeed. We
see it's appealing to people to cut costs.
We see the climate backlash these days in Europe, but also in the US and in many other places. After 20 years where we sold this story of all the benefits and jobs that the transition will deliver, we realize that this story is not completely right. And so are we mature enough today to accept the idea of, a Churchillian revolution, that is blood, sweat, and whatever. The costs are there. We need to confront the cost. And do we have, in our democratic system, do we have a majority of citizens who are ready to bear those costs? And that's a deep question these days.
Okay, I'm going to stick with you, Christian. So many climate plans assume we can define a cost-effective pathway for cutting emissions over time. Your research shows there could be puzzles and credibility problems in how carbon price paths are derived and sustained. What does that imply for how policymakers should think about the shape of climate policy over time, so not just the headline target?
So first thing, we need to remind the fact that there are a lot of possible climate policies. Those policies are difficult to implement too. Subsidies, you can do it as long as you have no large public debts, which is not completely true anymore, in particular in Europe. You can organize bans, but at some time people realize that it's also costly and it's also regressive socially. I mean, look at, for example, at the tentative in France to exclude all cars from downtown cities. This is politically very difficult to bear. And in fact, in France, they are currently dismantling that kind of policy, not only because it's costly for the people to purchase newer cars that pollute less the center of the cities, but it's also because it's regressive. I mean, people downtown are relatively rich. They will benefit from the depollution of that policy, but who will bear the cost? The people in the suburbs who are relatively poor. So you see that alternative to a carbon pricing mechanism as that kind of policies also have political acceptability issue. So economists have been promoting the idea to organize a transparent system based on carbon pricing. This carbon pricing, you can implement it through a carbon tax or a market for permits of CO2 emission, and that's the most efficient way to organize the decarbonization of our economy, because that will incentivize everyone to perform all the green actions whose cost per ton of CO2 saved, which is smaller than the carbon price that is implemented by the state. So you see that the carbon pricing mechanism is a policy that allows for aligning all the myriad of private interests with the common good by forcing everyone to internalize the collective cost of our emission. So there is a consensus among economists for promoting that kind of policy. The problem is it's also regressive. The problem is poorer people typically devote a larger fraction of their budget to energy. And so because a carbon pricing mechanism increase the cost of fossil energy, it's regressive. You put a larger share of the cost of transition on the shoulder of the poorest people in society. But the difference with other policies that also increase the cost of energy is that you extract a fiscal revenue by implementing a carbon price. And this fiscal revenue can be used to compensate the poorest people in society.
Alessio, you recently contributed to a World Economic Forum report that argues that affordability pressures and social alignment shape whether climate ambition holds. So when climate policy meets people's day-to-day realities, where do you think fairness concerns become most acute and why?
I think this relates a lot to what Christian was saying. And in a way, I'm glad that we come from a shared perspective in terms of discipline and of objective, so of trying to achieve a decarbonized society. And yet, I think we don't see eye to eye in terms of narratives on how to get people on board. And your question sort of gets to the heart of that. So in terms of the Churchillian Pact and whether people are ready for it, I think that not only are we not ready, but we're never going to be ready. As in, selling the green transition as sweat, blood, and tears is not going to work. That's why I look at the costs that Christian was rightly pointing out, and I think that they can be shouldered only if we look at them as investments. And so that companies are going to be willing to put money in the hundreds of billions of dollars if they look at it and they say this is an investment opportunity. We see it with AI, for example. They think that this is going to increase productivity, generate profits. And if we look around the world, the one country that is achieving a green transition is China, which is a country that has really framed the green transition as something that is in their interest. It's providing them lower cost energy, is providing them sectors like EVs and cars that they can become a leader in and that they can sell and export around the world and generate profit with it. And so this is, I think, the narrative that will work. And the reason why I don't think that people are ready for the Churchillian Pact, including in Europe, is that if you look at it, even small things that we've asked from people on the economy and climate dimension, or even environmental dimension, leads them to go crazy. Think of the ban on straws. Even that has led people complaining, protesting, imagining government telling me I can't use my straw and whatnot, which is something useless, except for very specific cases of people who have an issue. But in general, for wide society, it's something that doesn't have a purpose. And so the only way I see the transition happening and getting people on board is having a narrative, and not only a narrative, but having a set of policies, including the industrial policies that Christian was talking about and others, that show and showcase the opportunities that will be achieved. And this is the only way in which we will achieve a transition that is, which brings people on board, including, let's say, not the richest people in society. Because up until now, we have seen richer cohorts, more educated cohorts be willing to pay a price. And that's good. I think that that is really important, because if they're willing to spend that extra money to have the green electric vehicle alternative or the plant-based food alternative, that's great, because they allow for the scalability of technologies. At the end of the day, Christian was pointing out, electric vehicles might be more expensive than internal combustion engine cars. This is not something that is inherent in the technology. It's the result of the fact that we've been investing for 150 years in improving the efficiency of producing cars in the good old-fashioned way, and that electric vehicles are relatively recent on the block. As the scale goes up, they will become cheaper. But you need a small subset of initial consumers that is willing to pay more for it because it sees value in it. So I think that it's important that we have richer, more educated, more urban consumers that are willing to get on board with the green transition, but we will bring the rest of society, including poorer households, on board only once this is affordable. And it doesn't mean sacrificing things to get on board with the green transition, because if not, they will push back.
And definitely having the infrastructure as well around to make them practical to use. Yeah. Christian.
Yes, to discuss this more generally. I mean, keep in mind China has a comparative advantage because it's a coal-based economy. So it's not clear that Europe, even with the industrial policy, could duplicate what has been done in China to create the infrastructure to produce batteries and electric car in the same way China has been doing it. So that's something important to keep in mind. And also, I mean, I agree with the idea that we need to subsidize green R&D. I mean, that's one of the most efficient way to generate innovation with potential chance to generate energy systems that are competitive compared to fossil fuels. At the end of the day, that's the only way to solve the problem in a world where, if I believe Alessio, the only way to convince people to do the transition is to have a transition that increases purchasing power. I mean, at the end of the day, in order to get there, we need to produce energy that is competitive to fossil fuel. So that's a very, very challenging thing. And so that's why I still believe that Churchillian approach is necessary. I mean, pushing people again to realize that when they emit CO2, there bears some responsibility. And if they refuse to do something for that, for example, by voting for parties that are in favor of carbon pricing mechanism, for example, the only way to get there is to reintroduce some notion of individual responsibility. We are pushing too much the idea of collective responsibility in international forums, in debates about the role of corporation. At the end of the day, if we cannot convince consumers to accept less carbonized way of living, we will not go very far.
You'll have to convince some people as well that the carbon is causing a change in the climate. Because there are plenty of people out there who argue it's not. So it's just part of a cycle.
Mostly, I mean, in Europe, I agree with you with the Republicans in the US, but in Europe, we have a vast majority of people who understand the fact that emitting CO2, not emitting their CO2, but emitting CO2 is responsible for climate change. The issue I want to raise is we now need to induce people to realize that their own emissions is responsible for climate change.
Alessio, what kinds of institutions or forms of participation allow for a well-designed green transition, do you think?
I mean, it's interesting because it links to what you were saying at the beginning of whether it is possible to design policies that survive the electoral cycle, which the assumption in your question was that there is an electoral cycle. Are democracies better positioned than autocracies or vice versa in designing a green transition that works? Now, this is something that I have been writing about a bit, prompted by some of my students. So some of the students I've been teaching, I realized that, it was a sustainability course. And so they were very driven by matters of sustainability, of decarbonization. They were looking around and saying, look, China is achieving a lot and they are rolling out all of these solar panels, or they're doing all of these things, whereas we get lost in agreeing with the permits of whether we can actually get something done, and then it takes 10 years. Or you're in the US, and so maybe you achieve something in terms of policy under the Biden administration, then Trump arrives and unravels everything. And so could it be that maybe we have to sacrifice democracy on the altar of decarbonization? And this was a bit the beginning of that reflection. Now, my answer to that is careful what you wish for. Once you introduce an autocracy, the assumption in the back of these students' mind is always to assume that there's going to be a benevolent dictator that has decarbonization as a goal, which is not necessarily the case. That is the drawback of autocracies, is that it's always great if you assume that the person in charge is the one that is aligned with your own visions, but it's not going to be necessarily that. And second, from a technological perspective or an innovation perspective, remember that decarbonization is a marathon, is not a sprint. And so, yes, it might be that for the specific technology we have right now and for achieving something right now, yes, it's much quicker if you don't have to get all the permits done, or you can just move people around and create a new solar park and whatnot. But what we will need, for example, on aviation, we will need a lot of innovation and we will have to develop new solutions. And that is only one example. For other things, for steel, for cement, for a variety of things, we're still having to develop solutions. And what this means is that you need a setup that caters to sustained innovation, that attracts talents, innovative people, researchers, scientists who want to be part of your society. And if you become a very rigid and autocratic society, that's not necessarily going to be very attractive. And so remember that when you see the extra solar park going up, that is not only achieving something quickly in the short term.
Christian, climate change is a global public good, but policy is mostly national, obviously. So what's the strongest economic case for international coordination? And what is the biggest practical barrier to making that work? You've, like we've been talking about, you've got democracies who change governments all the time, and then you've got China, which is consistent in that respect anyway. What do you think are the big barriers?
Okay, let me answer to the last two questions, the one you raised to Alessio and the one you just raised now. So first thing, I fully agree with Alessio. Just published a book, I'm sorry, it's in French. The title translated in English is Economics of Climate in Action, with the I and the N in parentheses. In chapter 4 there, I look at exactly that issue of why not voting for Leviathan, to whom we would give the mandate to impose to us the action that we don't want to do. That's strange, but that's the idea eventually. So yeah, I agree perfectly with Alessio. The risk of having this Leviathan doing many other things that decarbonizing our society is key. And it raised the deep question. I think there is a link between freedom and fighting climate change. Many actions that are not based on the carbon pricing impose some limitation to freedom. One of the big experts in France, named Jean-Marc Jancovici, here is suggesting that the state should impose a limitation of round-trip airline travel by 3 over the lifetime of a person. Could you imagine the kind of limitation of freedom, how to control that? It's extremely difficult because energy is everywhere in our life. Limiting the way you use energy will impose a lot of restriction to your life, and it raised the issue of freedom. So that's one question. The second question about, it's also linked to the credibility issue you already raised earlier, and I failed to answer it. This question is about how to organize an international coordination. So most green actions are investment, and many actions are long-term investment. So for example, replacing your car, I keep my car for 15 years at least, retrofitting your apartment, replacing fossil fuel power plant by nuclear or windmills, it may at least 25 years. So it's long-term investment, and to trigger long-term green investment, It's not the current carbon price. That's not the current limitation or penalty policy on carbon, on climate change that matter. That's what will be the penalties paid by people in 20, 30, 40 years from now. Penalty that they will have to face if they do not make those investments today. And so there is clearly a credibility issue, whether it's carbon pricing or any other penalty system for polluters. That's irrelevant. I mean, at the end of the day, we have a credibility issue. And we have seen over the last 20 years the difficulty to impose public policies, climate policies that are costly to the people. Each time in France we tried to do that, there were a reaction that delimited that policy. So I propose with a friend and an expert in France named Jacques Delplat, we propose a solution to the credibility issue. In the past, Europe faced another credibility issue. It was on monetary policy, how to make sure that politicians accept to limit the reduction of interest rate at the time of election. Well, we create central banks with a mandate to control for monetary emission and interest rate. Why not doing the same thing for carbon pricing? Why not having a democratic mandate to an independent central bank for carbon that would be in charge of controlling the carbon price, the evolution of the carbon price over time in the coming decades in Europe, probably pushing it to numbers around 200, 300, 400 euros per ton of CO2. So providing this independence could generate some credibility into the system. Finally, about international coordination, I mean, we have an instrument in Europe, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. And this CBAM is not only a system that levels the playing field, I mean, imposing the same carbon price to all producers who want to sell their product in Europe, by not only imposing an internal carbon price in Europe, that's the ETS mechanism, but also forcing importers of products that generated emission in their place of production the same carbon price. So it's not only a level playing field mechanism, it's also a mechanism that induce our trade partners to put in place their own carbon pricing mechanism. Because if they impose their own carbon pricing mechanism, the tax they will have to pay when their products will enter into Europe will be based on the difference between their carbon price and our carbon price. And if they raise their carbon price, that will be the money they will be able to collect to fund whatever in their country, and it will not be money that will be used by Europe to compensate their local consumers. And we see already that in Europe, the anticipation of the creation of the EU CBAM implied that in Brazil, in China, in some place in Africa, they decided to put in place their own carbon pricing mechanism. So that's a source of hope for the emergence of an international coordination to fight climate change.
Okay, we always like to finish by looking ahead into the future. So, if we want climate policy that's effective and enduring, what's the one change you would each make to policy design, institutions, or the decision-making process to give us the best chance of balancing efficiency and fairness over the next decade? And why would you make that change?
I mean, obviously, for somebody that sees technology as at the heart, because it's what will allow green solutions to become more affordable and therefore allow the green transition to happen, I see a central role of technology. So supporting technology along the lines also of what Christian was saying, green R&D spending and so on, is at the heart of what I see as central. Perhaps, making it one policy and more tangible and connecting it to the international dimension. What I would want to see more of is partnerships between countries that are at the frontier of the green transition and countries that are not, looking for win-win solutions. So for a long time, there was this expectation that the way this should work is that rich countries should just transfer money or technology to poorer nations because of ethical concerns and because they have contributed to the problem more than others. Again, from an ethical or philosophical perspective, that might be right, but it's not going to happen, or it's not going to happen at the scale needed. And so what we need is instead partnerships that look for win-win solutions. And so, technology gets transferred, but this comes in exchange for, agreeing to buy, European products that are green or helping to provide the critical raw materials that are needed for the green transition or something like that. and to explore these bilateral partnerships, which, as you noticed, I didn't say between advanced countries and developing countries, because some of the countries at the frontier of the green technologies are also not the usual suspects. We were mentioning China, but there are others out there. So it's not Europe and the rest, or the West and the rest. There's other green players at the frontier.
Christian?
Yeah, I'm not a sociologist and I'm not a political scientist, but when I see the sociological and political landscape, in particular in Europe, I see two groups of people that we could try to convince to support an ambitious climate policy. I mean, we have the rich people who already purchase electric car, who already retrofit their apartment, who are ready to bear the cost of the transition. They are ready to face their responsibility toward future generations by bearing those cost. And then we have the lower side of the population that understand their responsibility, but at the same time, they are not ready to pay the cost. They don't have the financial strength to do that. So why not organizing climate policies where, through a carbon pricing mechanism, we use part or even the entire fiscal revenues of the carbon tax to compensate or even overcompensate the lower side of the distribution of income, so that we can generate electoral majority in the population, combining this rich part of the population, which is already convinced that we should do something, and the poorer part that would support the policy if they can be convinced that they will not lose any purchasing power through that policies. And that's possible through a carbon pricing mechanism with redistribution of the fiscal revenue.
Well, that's all we've got time for on this episode. Thanks to Alessio Terzi from the Bennett School of Public Policy and Christian Gollier from the Toulouse School of Economics for joining us. Fantastic chat, guys. Thank you very much. And thank you for listening to Crossing Channels. We'd love to hear what you think. Your reviews help us shape future episodes and make it easier for new listeners to find the show. If you enjoyed this one, why not explore some of our earlier episodes too, including Are Universities Ready for the Age of AI and Why Do We Choose What We Choose? And please join us next month when we'll be discussing what money can't buy, which is surely love, isn't it? According to the Beatles. Anyway, see you then.